Let's start and welcome to the roundtable on structuring the compliant token sale. Today we have, okay, I will give you time to introduce yourself. Sorry, I didn't remember everybody. By the way, you can tweet or post in Facebook with a hashtag, hashtag BEF LATOKEN or BEF 2018. So I think we'll start discussion with the current situation and then speak about how it will be developing in the nearest future. So we'll start with introduction. My name is Fedor Panteleev. I'm product director at LATOKEN. And Habeeb?
Sure. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Habeeb Syed. I'm a corporate and securities attorney, licensed in California, based out of DC. I advise crypto funds, ICOs, your traditional startups that have sort of gone into the blockchain space as well. Excited to be part of this conversation.
My name is Alex Lindgren. I'm a partner with Lindgren Oehm, also a small law firm with offices in Los Angeles, New York, and New Jersey. I practice out of Los Angeles myself, and I also work with both crypto funds, funds that are both focused in the space and entering into it that have been around for a while, as well as some issuers, particularly in the last 6 months.
Hi, my name is Joanne Park, and I am a compliance officer for 2 SEC-registered FINRA member broker-dealers. And I'm also a partner in ICO Advisors Group, which we do token consulting in tandem with the fundraising through the broker-dealers.
Thanks. I'm Tony Evans. I'm Vice Chairman of Blockchain Industries, a publicly traded blockchain and crypto based out of New York, but I am based out of Asia. I've been focused there for 15 years, and it's quite interesting the different regulations out of Asia to the rest of the world.
I'm not a lawyer, but I played one on TV, and I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night. So, no, my name is Jonathan Nelson. I am the founder of an organization called Hackers and Founders. We're one of the largest groups of nerds building startups in the world. Through that, we submitted a bunch of comments to the SEC on crowdfunding, which ended up landing me on an advisory committee in the SEC for a couple of years. So I believe I'm the only person who's actually served on an SEC advisory committee who's actually built a smart contract. And we are tokenizing stock. We are building an investment company that actually has tokenized stock. The companies that we invest in will have digital stock, and we will take them to crypto IPOs. And then I think we need to build a digital stock exchange for these types of stock certificates with compliance, reporting at that level, as opposed to at the governmental level, because governments are hard when you're on the internet, because where are you on the internet? I think that's a very big problem in regulatory. But I've done a bunch of work on securities issuance, digital stock issuance, crowdfunding regulation, all of that sort of stuff. And so I'm happy to talk about legal crap.
So there's a few different regulatory regimes that come into play here. To name a few, there's the CFTC, right? There's a question of whether or not the token is a commodity, which is one of the nuances we were discussing. There's a question of whether the token is a security, which tends to get most of the attention nowadays. And then there's also a question of whether or not a token issuer or someone involved in the space is a money services business. And that's something that's overlooked sometimes, I think. So I guess jumping into it, in my view, generally, most tokens, let's say if they're nothing else, are commodities. Then you're looking at analyzing under the Howey test, in light of the Munchie ruling, most recently, whether or not they're securities. To say a couple of words on that, there's been a lot of talk about how Munchie sort of categorizes all ICOs or cryptocurrencies as securities. There was a lot of speculation based on Chairman Clayton's comments, I think about a week and a half ago, that all ICOs were securities. But I think that's generally been dispelled. More recently, there were some comments about how Bitcoin, for example, was definitely not a security. that one was more obvious. There was comments about how Ethereum was not a security. So I'm just going to quickly lay out what I view as the framework through which to look at securities law in this space, right? Most ICOs that are raising money and have a company that's going to be engaging in some sort of venture, by default, they meet some of the requirements of the Howey test, right? What Munchie has decided to focus on, and what I believe Chairman Clayton merely restated in his comments that caused so much panic a week and a half ago, was that if you are one of these ventures and you're raising pre-utility, right, you're raising money in order to build out a platform, and your token doesn't have utility at that point, and you're advertising returns, you have a security on your hands, right? And that was nothing new that he stated. It just sort of restates Munchie, right? In light of the general Howey test as it already existed. What was more interesting were these more recent comments about Ethereum not being a security. So Ethereum, when it did its raise back in 2014, I believe, it did not have utility, right? Ethereum at the time, though, also did not tout returns. So I think this brings up an interesting question about how to look at ICOs moving forward. Generally, was Ethereum actually a security at the time? And has it now converted into a utility token? I think that's still an open question as to whether or not that can occur. There's been comments by Clayton that says it is possible, or was it never a security to begin with?
So I think the topic is how to structure a compliant token sale. And one of my frustrations at conferences like this with other places, I hear a lot of the same things that are rehashed. So I think that there is a basic, very general guideline of how, if you are issuing a token, that you should consider. And the first thing that I encourage people to say is, because and this is my perspective as a lifelong compliance officer for only registered entities. So we're regulated by FINRA. We're visited every year. We undergo exams. We get regulated by the SEC. They've come in to visit us, and they're actually in communications with us to talk about what's happening in the crypto space. This is part of their outreach to people in my community, registered advisors and registered broker-dealers, on what's going on. And I think part of that is, quite frankly, to ferret out illegal broker-dealer activity. And there is a ton of that going on. I hear it here, I hear it at other conferences, and it scares me. So the first thing that I say to you is be very skeptical. And I think that we're in a very dangerous phase of the kind of legal, from a legal perspective, pre-2017 DAO, as Alex and I were talking about, people did whatever they wanted, and they didn't know if the rules applied, and that's perfectly fine. But once that came out, up until January 2018, I think it's very clear where the SEC was headed, and we just got that pronouncement about 4 days ago, the Hinman speech. If you haven't read it, you should. And what's happening, I see, is a lot of big law firms and other advisors. They're reputable, they're expensive, and people go to them and pay them a lot of money and get either legal opinions, which is a very specific term from a legal perspective, not just an opinion from a lawyer. And they think that they're doing all these things and relying on esoteric no-action letters and what have you, and that is just not the case. And if you are not your own advocate to unearth the right service providers, you still may be engaging and unable to defend your token issuance being in compliance with either registration or exemption laws. And that's something that is why the regulators say you have to be on a case-by-case basis. There is no blanket rule, and you'll never see one that doesn't even exist in the regular private fund exemption securities playground now. So for people who are expecting more laws or more changes to laws, our securities laws and commodities laws come from the 30s and 40s. So, it's going to be a long wait, I think, and what I feel that Hinman said was that we are using existing laws, and you better figure out how to, operate within them. And for people who are hoping for more, that's great, but you need to find the right service provider who will do that. and that includes regulated broker-dealers that, who are properly licensed, or you're only fundraising from the issuer yourself. That includes finding the right counsel who will not just issue a legal opinion letter that you think is going to somehow defend you in front of a regulator. It won't. There are the right custodians, perhaps a transfer agent. There's just a whole bunch of different players, including token developers, who I've seen take commissions out of a fundraise. And that is, very on the line, if not slightly past it, and something that I could not engage in. And so, these are the things that you need to worry about when you are considering a token issuance.
I think I'm going to have a different perspective because I'm not from the US, and I'm based out Japan, so focused on from the Asia perspective. Okay, Japan actually has guidelines on ICOs and how to structure it, and they've actually taken a more aggressive approach of actually regulating exchanges. Exchanges has to be regulated. There's only 16 that's regulated in Japan at the moment, and if you issue an ICO, you have to comply by the rules of them. Okay, so that has been a huge effect on the marketplace. Asia still accounts for over half of trading in the whole global perspective. Looking at it, okay, I agree with what you said about broker-dealer, okay, but also I don't think it's from a country-to-country basis. An ICO is a global thing. It's like the internet, okay? You can't look at it just from one country perspective. That's a very, very old-fashioned approach, okay? If you're issuing an ICO, you know it's going to go global, okay? It's Pandora's box, okay? Once you opened it, okay, you know it's going to go everywhere. So you better have the best intentions. Make sure from a legal perspective, an accountancy perspective, that you're doing it for the right intention, and build from there.
That has nothing to do with it. Sorry to interrupt. I've worked in the private fund world for years, and when we market the securities, whether they're issued from offshore, off the United States, or whether they're onshore, when you enter, for example, the EU or the EEA, you have to comply with each country's specific rules, and they are so much more specific than they are in the United States. You think it's bad here? We've had to go through, for just example, to Germany, where one of the requirements to sell a private placement was to get a letter from the SEC saying that this was compliant. If anyone has worked with the SEC, they don't do that. That's part of what the SEC says, that they don't approve regulations. And so you have to make sure that your promoter or marketer is registered or falls with an exemption. The security itself is registered or falls with an exemption, that your actual distributor, it's very specific. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that I see here is that people don't realize how specific even FINRA approved lines of business are. So you could find a broker-dealer who says, oh, we could do private placements, but that doesn't mean they can take it in NASDAQ, and certainly doesn't mean that they're gonna run an exchange. And everyone thinks that the golden ticket is to be on some kind of US-based exchange. Those are far and few between. And one of the things that an ATS needs is a chief compliance officer, and we've been trying to find, just for guidance, a couple. I found 2. It's that hard, and I've been doing compliance my whole life, and I've been asked if I could be an ATS compliance officer, and there isn't enough money for that kind of risk that I would take on.
For those in the audience who are not familiar, ATS is Alternative Trading Systems, which is how you trade unregistered securities.
And that's what people think will provide the liquidity, but it is a whole different ballgame, and every little step of custody, settlement, trading, all those are different licenses, all those are different permissions by FINRA.
Just to clarify the topic of discussion here, these issues of registered broker-dealers, transfer agents, clearinghouses, ATSs, exchanges, they come into play once that security determination has been made. When we're talking compliant token sale, are we discussing now security specifically?
We're talking in general the things you need to consider if you want to do a compliance, what people call, which I don't like, but they generally call it SEC compliant token sale. That's a little bit of a misnomer.
So I've talked with 12 different law firms in 10 different legal jurisdictions about this. TLDR, you really don't want to do this in the United States. And we are...
I rather firmly disagree, but I'll get to that.
If you are going to do a ICO in the United States, 99.97% of them are going to be a security. The question that you have to answer is, are people going to buy my token because they're going to make a profit? Do people want to make a profit when they buy my token? If the answer is yes, you are a security. You are not a snowflake. You are not have beautiful little utility magic dust on top of your token. If people are buying it because they want to make a profit, you are a security. Now, there are three easy kind of ways to actually do that. One is you only raise money from rich people, accredited investors. That's a Reg D exemption. Step two, I want to raise money from the poorest 96% of the United States as well. Excuse me, 93%. That's the unaccredited investors. Now I can actually do it under Regulation CF. It's called crowdfunding. And you're crowdfunding a security, just like you would crowdfund a stock. You can raise up to $1 million doing that. Tend to have to use a portal. Look at that up. If you want to raise up to $50 million, you can use Reg A+, and that is called a mini IPO, and you have to get approved by the SEC to actually do that. When I was on the SEC Advisory Committee last year, there had been 69 total people applying for Reg A+ offerings. Only 19 of them got approved. They were actually wondering why these people ended up dropping off so much. But it is possible, and there is a way to do that. So, raise from rich people in the United States, you're good. Raise from the poor, raise from everybody in crowdfund, you need to fall under Regulation CF or Regulation A+. If you are not a security, if for some reason you are not registered with the FCC, FinCEN, Financial Services Regulatory Authority, had said, if you're not there, then bitch, your ass is mine, and you need to actually apply for a money transfer license, which costs you $1 million per legal jurisdiction. There are 58 legal jurisdictions in the United States. So you're looking at about $60 million to get essentially a banking license to actually operate your money, your beautiful little non-security token.
That's well put. I think that it's a good cautionary note. I'm going to take a slightly more upbeat take on this. And I'm going to say thank you to Director Hinman from the SEC, who made me feel much more comfortable in what I'm about to tell you. I think there's a lot of concern being raised here about, one, how do you comply with regulation? And two, what is the characterization of the token at the point of issuance? And then what is its characterization down the road? So let's start from US does not have a utility token. He's absolutely right. There's no such thing as a utility token. Dismiss that from your head. Tokens in the US, as best as at least we can tell, exist on a spectrum. And I am paraphrasing the regulators here. They exist on a spectrum between a commodity, let's take Bitcoin, which is effectively gold on a distributed ledger, to a security, which is a stock on a distributed ledger, very clearly a security. Most of the projects that I have seen in this space bridge that divide. That's what makes them interesting. It's what makes them difficult and complicated. And when you are structuring a token offering, right, let's first distinguish between the pre-sale or the early stage financing, which you generally will want to raise either under a combination of Regulation D and Regulation S, private fund exemptions or crowdfunding exemptions. At the point where you're still building something, and it's a centralized enterprise, to paraphrase Director Hinman, you're probably selling a security. But note that the thing that you're selling, right, which is usually these days some sort of right to a future receipt of a token or a royalty instrument, as the case may be, that's a security. The question of whether or not the token itself, when it is issued out to the public in one way, shape, or form, whether through mining, native interaction, a sale event, whatever, is whether that's a security is a distinct question. And the really interesting question is what happens when you have a token that starts its life as a security and moves through usage, through development, through market uptake towards a commodity. Ethereum is probably the best example of this. It's as cited by Director Hinman. The initial sale of Ethereum by the Ethereum Foundation was probably a sale of a security. Nevertheless, we feel fairly confident in saying that Ethereum at this point, as an asset, is a commodity. It's freely exchangeable. That doesn't mean it's not regulated. That means that it is subject to the fundamental anti-fraud enforcement of the CFTC, the commodities regulator, and the FTC, the Fair Trade Commission. So in other words, start from the viewpoint that this will never sort of escape the law, right? You will always have some sort of fundamental anti-fraud applying, so come in with good intentions. Recognize that your initial fundraising is almost inevitably going to involve the issuance of a security, but you want to start thinking at a very early stage about, do we want to run this as a centralized enterprise, right? In which case, you are going to almost inevitably end up having to deal with the securities laws on an ongoing basis for the token, or, more likely in my opinion, end up dealing with licensure as a money transmitter, which is expensive and difficult, although not quite $60 million across the US, at least not with any reasonable law firm. The flip side is that most of the projects that I've encountered have some sort of intermediary stage, because pure utilitarian functionality isn't enough. The question of whether or not something is decentralized to the point that we no longer have a regulatable entity, that it makes sense to place prophylactic rules on, is nuanced, it's fact-specific, and you need to think about here's some highlights, right? Not just is the development complete, right? But how are the tokens held, right? So if you have a disproportionate percentage of the tokens held by insiders for the foreseeable life of the platform, they have an effective ability to act as a central banker or a guarantor of the price. That's probably going to make it into either a security or make those centralized operators into money transmitters. Similarly, even if the tokens are widely dispersed, do you have disproportionate control over the GitHub account? Do you have authority to reject, under the governance provisions, community-adopted proposals? Can you exercise intellectual property rights or nodal control because you run most of the nodes over a particular network? Post-functionality, that may still render you into a money transmitter or into an ongoing sort of regulated securities issuer. Flip side is, and I think this is one of the most wonderful and positive things to come out of the US regulators, is they basically said, to the extent that you can get to a truly decentralized enterprise, we don't see something to regulate anymore, right? We think that fundamental anti-fraud enforcement against bad actors in the marketplace is sufficient. The bad news, I think for issuers in particular in the room, is that is a very hard thing to do. It's hard not necessarily because it's mechanically hard or it's legally complex. I actually think this has all been pretty...
But it's also not the goal. I mean, when you're doing a token issue, your ultimate goal is probably not to be so decentralized that there's no profitability control, right? Like, that's not 99.99% of token issuers. Most people start with a product and then, or a product idea, and then figure out how to either tokenize it or, get investors so that they can have return. It's the business.
That's possible. I'll be honest, that hasn't been my experience.
Okay.
And I will say that, again, paraphrasing Director Hinman here, there has been a recognition that this has the potential for a new form of enterprise, right? The joint stock company is old. It's about 400 or 500 years old. The concept of and it has severe governance problems. The idea of testing out some sort of new governance option for business enterprises, I think, is very appealing to the regulators. The former head of the lab, CFTC, said himself, we could envision a world, the regulators could envision a world in which they regulate activity rather than individuals, particularly when they have an open blockchain to look at and they can see exactly what's going on in the market. But what I would say is that I've had a lot of entrepreneurs come to me who want to build genuinely decentralized systems, marketplaces, platforms. And to the extent that you want to do that, great.
You're contradicting yourself, though. You just said if an entrepreneur wants to build a decentralized system, by definition, If I am the entrepreneur, I am building a decentralized system, I am centralized, therefore I am issuing a security. Eventually, maybe the ecosystem will take off, maybe the Ethereum network will blow up, and then, you know what, the magic SEC dust will actually say, yes, you are now okay. I think the reason that the SEC actually did that is it was very interesting when they actually said that, yes, there is sometimes when securities become utilities. That actually just happened in one of the SEC commissioner's comments yesterday or 2 days ago. But if we're talking about structuring a compliant ICO now, and you are structuring it, you are issuing a security, and you should follow securities laws. At some point, you might be able to turn this into a decentralized sort of thing, but at the same point in time, you have to let go of it, and you have to let the ecosystem kind of run with it.
I agree with you.
So, yes, but I think he drew a very clear line between the pre-issuance and between the actual issuance of the token. So I think keeping that in mind, there wasn't a contradiction.
No, but what I think Jonathan is saying is that there's still securities rules that cover whether you are in any phase. It's just a matter of whether you're in registration or versus exemption. And one of the things I think is to demystify how scary security regs can be. There's a lot of freedom in being an exempt security. A lot. You know, Reg D has run for years on all the private funds, hedge funds, private equity funds, and there's a lot of, you know, AUM and money that has been there.
So there is, but I think the issue is that ICOs can also conduct themselves in that way. The problem comes in the secondary market, though, right? I think that's the true draw.
Well, that's where I think people think the exchanges are going to be this panacea, and because it is unproven, it is unsubstantiated, we all look to that, and I think that's perfectly fine. It's just that there isn't enough information from my perspective, including myself, of how an ATS actually runs, how to get on an ATS.
So I've looked into this a little bit.
I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just like, I was going to say, most people start at the beginning and try and build it up. Okay, I say reverse engineer it. Okay, go to the exchanges. Okay, I'm talking from Asia. Okay, I know everybody else is talking from the US. Okay, I'm a Brit. What do you expect? But I'm focusing on. Okay, you go to the exchanges and you say, okay, guys, you're regulated. Okay, so what? Okay, I want to do an issuance. Firstly, they say, okay, you're a security or a utility. Okay, and then you take it back from there. Okay. And that's then.
Why do you think there are existing ATSs? FINRA or the SEC actually lists all the ATSs that they've approved. So let's say there's 40 of them. I don't know what the real number is. But why do you think no existing real ATS right now with a license is taking on tokens and therefore kind of curing that secondary market liquidity
So
issue?
it doesn't
In the
cure,
United
an
States.
ATS does
In the
not
United States.
cure
Yes.
liquidity.
But I'm talking.
An analogy is like, you're saying in Japan, you know, start with the exchanges. So why do you think the United States isn't doing that as well when we actually have ATSs existing now?
I can't say it because they're recording it. Okay.
We'll talk later.
So I'll say.
Okay.
an
You should
ATS
talk. Okay, I'll let you talk. Okay.
An ATS does not cure liquidity, right? You're still subject to a bunch of laws regulating how those private securities you have can be
So
traded.
you're saying ATSs are not for liquidity?
They are for liquidity. They don't provide the liquidity that a cryptocurrency does, avoiding securities laws completely.
I don't necessarily
do.
think cryptocurrencies are that liquid.
Which is why you want to do these offshore and trade on offshore exchanges.
And that's why you go to the largest liquidity. Okay.
So even if you do an offshore ICO, I want to be clear, I want to also echo the upbeat viewpoint that was taken. Not only are there these comments by Lindgren recently about decentralized organizations, but even with centralized organizations, we haven't seen any explicit approval, right? But what we have seen are potential pathways for centralized companies, centralized ventures, to continue to do token raises. ICOs, this idea of crowdfunding, you know, if you remember 5-6 years ago, it kicked off with things like Kickstarter, right?
That's not equity crowdfunding. I used to be the CCO and CLO for crowdfunder. That is a completely different analogy.
I'm not talking about Reg CF. I'm talking about.
I'm not talking about Reg CF either. I'm going to tell you something.
Right.
We started a broker-dealer crowdfunder. It is not a funding portal because we did not think that that would be.
So I'm not talking about equity crowdfunding. What I'm talking about is a concept.
But that's the equivalent of where people go for ICO.
Right. I understand. I'm trying to draw a line of reasoning here, though. Right. When you had something like Kickstarter that sells a product, right, someone can hold in their hand or whatever that is. I feel like that is the essence of a utility token. It's not a physical product, but it is a company saying, look, we're going to be creating this thing, or we have created this thing that allows you to use our platform.
There are no utility tokens. That's bad legal advice.
Again, there's no legal concept of a utility token, but we're talking about the lack of qualification as a security.
Did you have a question?
If one has a token which is considered a security in the U.S., just to keep it simple, and one does an offshore ICO, and the tokens are traded on an offshore exchange, what happens when they make their way into the hands of U.S. retail investors?
So we are doing that, and we are essentially only going to work with exchanges that do strong KYC and AML and keep U.S. investors off.
It really will be multiple liability. The issuer has to ensure that they're working with people who will not let that happen. You cannot just go, oops, because the second that pathway is open, you open yourself the exchange, the issuer, a whole bunch of other, vendors perhaps, that if even inadvertently you end up with U.S. investors that cannot be in there, the SEC has, their opening, and that's all they need. And that's what essentially happened to Dow, right? It's German-based, sold to some U.S. investors. Even if you sell to U.S. investors offshore, the SEC still has its reach. So that's why it's very hard, I think, for everyone here, when I hear, oh, go offshore, that may or may not be true, but the U.S. is a very big market to ignore for the lifetime of a company. And you know what I mean? So you may start off offshore, and I'm perfectly happy with that. But I also hear we're testing it out in Asia or in Europe because it's friendlier or what have you. But ultimately, if you want to be a global brand or a global product, the fact that you will touch some U.S. domiciled person or actually be in the United States, I mean, that is a huge market for you to cut off.
And by the time you're in the U.S., you can maybe be a utility.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
So I would just clarify, I don't think there's any entities that's creating laws or anything like that. They're clarifying what exists. And, that's one of the, for me as a compliance officer, terminology can be important because one misunderstanding can lead you into an exam. Or something further down that you are trying to just re-clarify, and it ends up being important. And there's a lot of terms here that people use flippantly, which is fine because we're all educating ourselves. But from a financial services perspective, you do have to be careful.
Okay, so to clarify my question, as digital platform that we're speaking of,
Yes. So at this point. So at this point, in terms of a judicial review, remember we only get to a judicial review if there's a problem, right? So unless you're misbehaving, no one ends up in front of the judge. That said, there is the ongoing Liquidity case in the Eastern District of New York, which has given some insight into how courts are viewing this. There was also, I think it was called the Recoin case and a couple of others on the CFTC side, which affirmed the sort of concurrent jurisdiction for the time being between the CFTC, SEC, and FinCEN over the sector, and they're basically carving it up. And two, that they are, regulated or governed by some sort of anti-fraud thing somewhere, and that to the extent that you think you don't fall under any U.S. law, you're probably wrong. But that's about the extent of the judicial review we've received on this.
There have been a number of legal enforcement actions taken actually against. So our lawyer used to be a federal prosecutor and brought the first two enforcement actions against crypto companies in San Francisco in 2014 and 2015. If you actually look, the SEC actually has a list of all of the enforcement actions that it's actually listed. And they've taken, last year I think they took about 4 or 5. But those are just an out-and-out Ponzi scheme. and actual fraud.
And I should note that, again, there's enforcement actions are regulatory actions, right? They're interpretive actions by an interpretive body. And to the extent that we've had actual direct statements from judges, who are the only actual source of law on this, it's been pretty limited. We know that they've given a fairly wide cart to the regulators to try to sort this out, and that's about all we know, really.
Just from my perspective, okay, I feel left out, all US people jumping on us. So basically from Asia, they don't, like from Japan, they don't actually do it from the judge's point of view because they've actually done it from the exchanges. So they just say, okay, like any kind of secret coin or anything like that, they will tell the exchanges to kick them all off. Okay, so they give directive, and they basically make the exchanges regulate it. Okay, and the reason for that is, without the exchanges, this whole system would just collapse, okay? There has to be liquidity, okay? So the viewpoints that from an Asia, from Japan perspective is, okay, we will give you guidelines and we will give you licenses. If you're going to have an exchange, you play by our rules, okay? If we give you guidelines, you enforce it. If you don't enforce it, we'll take away your license. And that's the way they're doing it there. Different perspective here. And to answer the question, you said, why the US? Okay, I think it's the difference between states and federal, okay? The jurisdiction looks at it from a one country kind of policy. Go for it.
How would you structure an ICO in Japan? What's the process to do that?
Go and speak to the FSA to begin with, speak to then speak to an exchange, then get an exchange on board, okay? And then you can then work with them based on their AML and KYC, okay? And then you basically start at the end and work yourself backwards, okay? And from that perspective, you have the legal point of view from different jurisdictions. And if you want to look from Asia, then you look at it from different jurisdictions going forward. You don't look at it from, okay, Japan's giving me this directive, I'll stick to this, okay? You look at it and going, okay, what is the plan of the whole thing, okay? And the situation is, if you deviate off that, the exchange will just kick you off, okay? And then you've just wasted a huge amount of money, okay? And I'm not going to give all my free advice here today, so nice try though, okay?
I think we're done for a couple of questions. Yeah.
For investors and then subsequent users of the token are,
yeah.
You need to be concerned about where you are, generally speaking. And this is a beyond token offering point that I hope everyone takes away, because I see this, and I think all the panelists will agree, we see this in the market quite often. Where you are has less importance than you think to what regulatory framework applies to you. Who you sell to, who has access to your products or tokens, and whose money you take, that's what matters. Because as a general rule, large states, whether that's Russia, China, Japan, the United States, or the European Union and its member states, won't let offshore entities interact with their citizens and then get off scot-free because they happen to be in, Seychelles or where have you.
Mic drop. That is an issuer's responsibility to know where your token, obviously you're going to list it. And when you work with vendors who you don't think, back to what other panelists were saying, have good walls to protect the sieves that can happen, then you become liable. You have a lot of risk. And some of the clients we've taken on, we have said you should only work with exchanges that are based in the United States, that have really good, offer custodial services that will fairly pass muster as a qualified custodian. They're starting to emerge, but the ones that came in the earlier days are very successful, I don't deny it. But it takes a very long time to right such a big ship. And so you'll see things like Coinbase buying an ATS, buying a broker-dealer, buying, an IA. But that doesn't necessarily, in and of itself, mean that they can do all the things that one might need as a token issuer, just as an example. As I said, you need the right license approvals from FINRA in order to engage in certain things. So it's really a very onion layer type analysis, and I encourage every token issuer to make sure to protect themselves and their businesses that you understand every layer. You can't just defer to outside counsel or an independent advisor.
So I think you might be talking one step underneath that even. Why are exchanges like Binance taking on so many tokens if they risk enforcement, from the SEC or other regulatory bodies, from FinCEN, right?
That's not
true. They can always, no.
That's not true.
Yeah.
So the country of Switzerland had how many years, hundreds of years of secretive banking laws? The United States Treasury Department broke them down. They broke them down. My friend used to work for UBS, and the president of UBS, who is Swiss, could not enter the United States because there was a warrant out for his arrest. They caved like that. Yeah. Right. And names went, just like at Coinbase, you have to pay taxes. And our government can squeeze people like nobody's business. And so, excuse me? Exactly. But my point is that it was, how many years of really solid, Swiss secret banking laws toppled once the U.S. Treasury needed to get what it needed, which was tax receipts. And that government and that country crumbled on that. And now I heard someone from Switzerland say it's very difficult to open up a Swiss bank account if you have an American passport.
So there's also enough exchanges trying to do this right out there. There's been a lot that have dropped a lot of tokens that are very strict about, right? Bittrex, for example, who I've worked with, they're very strict about who they're letting on. You go out to these exchanges outside the country, you pay them $300,000, in some cases $1 million plus, you get listed. Right? Here, Bittrex won't take an application fee, right? You have to work to make sure that your token is compliant, and I'll use the word utility token again at the risk of being attacked, but that it's not a security or falls into other regulated areas, and at that point they'll list you.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we ran out of time, so we need to close our discussion. Thank you. Thank you.